Okay, there we go. You guys can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So I think we're live. We're ready to go. So hello, everybody. Dimitri Lascaris here for Reason to Resist on, I'm losing track of the time. I guess it's April 18th, Friday, April 18th, 2025. And we are here to have a discussion that'll be primarily focused upon the debates that happened this week in the Canadian federal election, the leaders' debates. And I am very pleased to be joined today to have this discussion by Yves Engler, author and activist who has been described as Canada's Noam Chomsky. Thank you for joining us today, Yves. And our other guest today is Alex Tyrrell, longtime leader of the Green Party of Quebec. Welcome to Reason to Resist, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
And I've known Alex and Yves for many years, and they have been fearless critics of the Canadian political elite, Canadian foreign policy, always demonstrated a willingness to speak truth to power, and have been on the receiving end of some flack because of that, as have I, frankly. And I think that they are both excellent commentators to have on our show today to offer a critical, but hopefully, informative and constructive perspective on Canada's federal election and these leaders' debates. Before we begin, and thank you very much for joining us today, please make sure, if you find this to be an informative video, to like the video. If you're not a subscriber to Reason to Resist, we encourage you to become a subscriber. Help us to broaden our audience. And so, as I've indicated, we're going to focus on the Canadian federal election, which happens on April 28th in about 10 days' time. Before we talk about the leaders' debates, which is going to be the focus of the second half of our conversation, and after that we will have a Q&A. I'd like to start by taking a look at where the parties currently stand in the polls. So if you could pull up image number 1, Rami. And this is a poll from Leisure. There are many polls out there right now, but the results that they're yielding are broadly similar, and I've chosen Leisure because it's reputed to be the most accurate of the many polling agencies in Canada. As you can see, as of, I think this was Thursday, the Liberal Party of Canada is in the lead at 43% of the popular vote, the Conservatives 38, NDP 8, the Bloc Québécois, which is confined to the province of Quebec, 6, Green Party of Canada 3, and all of those parties have seats in Parliament. And then there's the People's Party of Canada, which has no seats in Canada's Parliament, has never had seats in Canada's Parliament. It's at 2%. Now, it is, I think, interesting to compare these current polling results to where the parties were in December of this year. And this was when Justin Trudeau was still the leader of the Liberal Party, the governing party. And no one knew at that point in time whether he was going to resign, and if so, who would replace him. If you could pull up image 2, Rami, this shows us the Leisure of voting results or polling results from December. Mark Carney became the leader of the Liberal Party and then Prime Minister in March last month. So in December, before the leadership contest in the Liberal Party began, the Conservatives were way ahead, poised to have a crushing victory at 43%. The Liberal Party of Canada was at 21%. The NDP were doing much better than they are now at 19%. Bloc more or less at the same place. And the Greens were doing modestly better. Instead of 3%, they were at 5%. So there has been a massive shift in voter sentiment since Mark Carney the former Goldman Sachs banker, governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, became the leader of the Liberal Party and then the Prime Minister of Canada without, by the way, ever having been elected to any office and without having won a seat in Canada's Parliament prior to becoming the Prime Minister. My overall impression, because I'm having difficulty ascertaining any meaningful differences between the policies being advocated by Mark Carney and his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, my sense is that this huge shift in voter sentiment happened for non-substantive reasons, and I'm trying to be kind there. The faces of the Liberal leader have changed, but have the policies changed that much? Yves, I'd like to start by asking you, what do you think accounts for the massive shift in voter sentiment after Carney replaced Justin Trudeau?
Well, I think people were tired of Justin Trudeau. 10 years, the tendency is to get tired of the individual. So that, I think, is an important part. And then, of course, Donald Trump's annexation and different tariff threats. I think that Pierre Poilievre is quite clearly a sort of Donald Trump light or a Canadian MAGA or whatever. And he was really kind of campaigning in that way quite aggressively until the last couple months. And so the sort of media and the whole kind of perception machine, I think, has done a good job of portraying Carney as sort of better to deal with Donald Trump. And Carney kind of benefited from kind of interesting dynamic, I thought, in terms of the Liberal leadership race. He benefited from having this sort of this ostensible, important resume, Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of UK, but not really having taken many positions. So he was, Chrystia Freeland, his main challenger, had, of course, taken lots of positions on lots of things over many years. And so he can kind of like not really just sort of create an impression. So I think that Carney has been able to kind of continue that even during the election campaign, though, of course, he's taken some more clear positions in the last month or so during the election. But he still sort of benefits from this sort of resume, but not too much, things that may kind of anger people or people might doubt on. But yeah, there's no real substantive difference. Clearly, Carney is the Trudeau candidate. All of Trudeau's people are behind Carney. And it's just, Poilievre is correct to say this would be a fourth Liberal term if Carney was to win.
Right. And just so you know, that background noise, or there's some family activity going on at Yves' place. Nobody is being assaulted. Just please don't be concerned. Now, Alex, do you have a similar take to that of Yves, or what's your view about this massive shift in voter sentiment that's happened in the last?
I think that the Liberals have been able to capitalize off of the Donald Trump situation. A lot of people are afraid of this trade war and also these annexation threats. So I think sometimes when you have crises like that, the voters are a little bit more feeling more vulnerable. And like Mark Carney, he's got this sort of aura of having gone through the financial crisis, and the country did not completely fall apart in that crisis, but at the same time, they gave away billions and billions of dollars of public money into private corporations, into the banks and stuff like that. So did he really manage that crisis well? But people have seen him manage a crisis before. So I think that, in terms of people's sense of security, they're going over to Carney. And since he hasn't really been in active politics, he doesn't have like the baggage that Chrystia Freeland or Justin Trudeau had. He's a little bit more of a blank slate. We've only really heard him talk about economic issues until he became prime minister. But that blank slate could go either direction, right? Sometimes he's saying that, suggesting that there is a genocide in Palestine. Other times he's appointing a chief of cabinet that is very close to Israel and stuff like that. So I think that having Mark Carney there really gives the left our work is cut out for us, because there might be a possibility to influence on certain issues, but he's also adopted a lot of conservative policies. So it might be further right than the Trudeau government, but not conservative. So that can present an additional challenge for the left. because sometimes when it's a conservative in power, even if they're doing the same thing as the liberals, it's easier to mobilize a population against a conservative government than a liberal one.
Yeah, and just so people who don't know, that chief of staff that Alex referred to is Marco Mendocino, one of the wildest, craziest Zionist fanatics in the Justin Trudeau caucus. And when it comes to the whole financial crisis, and how Canada fared, at the time, my full-time activity was securities class actions, and I was very much attuned to what was going on. It was my job to be aware of, what was happening in financial markets in Canada. And it's not well understood, I think, in Canada that the reason why Canada fared well relative to the United States, it still had serious challenges to confront during the financial crisis of 2007, 2009, is because there was a pre-existing regulatory regime in place that had nothing to do with Mark Carney governing banks, that was more stringent, with all of its imperfections. It was still more stringent, more effective regulation than what you had in the United States and, other Western countries like Britain. And Mark Carney kind of benefited from that as the governor of the Bank of Canada, but he had nothing to do with putting that regulation in place. Now, a second issue I'd like to raise with both of you before we go on to talk about the leaders' debates is voter turnout. And you'll see up here that Rami has put on the screen. These are the statistics for voter turnout in Canadian federal elections all the way throughout the whole post-World War II period. And if you look at the elections in the upper half, which are prior to 1993, you'll see that in almost every case, the voter turnout was between 70 and 80%. The highest voter turnout was in the 1962 election, which is 79%. And then in October 1993, in that federal election, the voter turnout dipped slightly below 70%, and it has never reached the 70% threshold since then. The most recent election, 2021, it was the lowest voter turnout in the last 3 years and the fourth lowest voter turnout in the post-World War II period. So, there seems to be in general a downward trend in voter turnout. I'm interested in your thoughts about this. Let me start with Alex. And I take it you'll agree, Alex, there has been a distinct change in the last 30 years or so in the level of voter turnout. What's your sense of why that's happened? Why are fewer people in Canada coming out to vote during this period, 1993 to 2025?
Well, I think even if you look at this election, I've never been less inspired to vote than any other election that I've had a vote in. And even in the Quebec election as well, the last one was one of the lowest turnouts in history. So there's kind of a disengagement, people not really following politics that much. Maybe a lot of people that, just see the parties as all being kind of bullshit, and not feeling inspired to go and vote. I think that's the big thing that gets to people. And when it comes to that day, if there's nobody that inspired them, then why should they bother? And in this election, we look at it like all of the parties are in favor of warfare and NATO and, international confrontations and stuff like that. So it almost feels like whoever you vote for, you're giving a kind of consent or approval to the system, right? And there's no way to really express your dissatisfaction. There's none of the above option or anything like that. So I think that could explain it. And obviously people are distracted with all this fast information that we're consuming through social media and stuff like that. But the parties have to really do more, I think, to connect with people and to inspire people, because even like Carney, he's got all this momentum. It's not necessarily because people believe in him. It's that he's not Polyev. He's not, he's going to stand up to Trump or stuff like that. But it's unfortunate to see how little people care about politics and how little inspired they are to debate the future of the country and to make choices and stand by them.
Yeah, you make a very interesting point, Alex. This dip, in the mid-90s that happened, and as I said, we never returned to the 70% threshold of voter turnout since then. It more or less coincided with the beginning of the internet era. Whether there's a relationship between the two, I don't know, but the timing is interesting. In any event, these low voter turnouts, what they meant was that in the last three elections, Justin Trudeau's Liberals. They won, in 2015, 2019, and 2021. And they were able to secure a government and hold office, be the governing party for 10 years with 20.4% of eligible voters in 2021, 22.2% of eligible voters in 2019, and the highest proportion of eligible voters who voted for the Liberals was in 2015, and that was 27%. So the Liberals have been able to win 3 straight elections and govern for a decade without ever achieving the votes of more than 27% of eligible voters. Yves, do you think this can fairly be described as a democratic outcome?
No. When they made a big thing about trying to overthrow Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, they talked about the low voter turnout in the Venezuelan election. I showed the numbers. Maduro got substantially more than Justin Trudeau did, even though only 40 some odd % voted because the opposition boycotted. So even if you just look at these numbers, you find that, it's small proportion. I think the voter turnout is the downward slide of voter turnout may be to do with the internet. It's also, I think, to do with neoliberalism. If you look at the sort of the most front of mind crisis in the country over the past couple years, I think the climate crisis probably should be the most front of mind, but it's not. The housing crisis. There's no one really saying, like, they make it seem like it's something complicated. It's not at all complicated to build house. I mean, we know how to build houses. We know how to put public money into building houses. But no one comes out and says, why don't we just take, 75% of the military's budget, or let's significantly increase taxes on everyone making over, anyone who has more than $50 million, we take 80% of it right away, or something like that, and just build housing and just build public housing and put a bunch of money into co-op housing. We've done that in the past. We did it until recently, and they're so nervous about, including the NDP, about going outside of the bounds of neoliberal thinking, of the quote unquote market, or quote unquote corporations and private investment, that they've made the question of housing and building large amounts of public housing something that's sort of complicated, and so now is it democratic? Now the other part to the democratic question is not just the narrow electoral issue, which the first past the post has a big problem with, and allows for a government to win 20 some odd % of eligible voters and be government for 10 years. The other part to it, of course, as important and probably more important in terms of undermining democracy, is the structure of the media, is the structure of the think tank world, is the structure of the whole sort of like ideological arena, and also the economic arena, which is, of course, very non-democratic. And obviously the economy is run by, based upon who has more wealth. And the media sphere is mostly operates on those grounds as well. And so these simple questions like, let's just build lots of public housing by taking public resources and building public housing as we've done historically, that's just like off of the agenda, because it doesn't serve the interests of power. So no, I would say that there's some democracy in Canada, but it's obviously very constrained.
Yeah, I'd like to call it a quasi-democracy, with the quasi slowly going extinct. So before we move to the leaders' debate, I want to mention a third and final preliminary issue, and that is the exclusion of the Green Party of Canada at the very last minute from the leaders' debate. And this is quite a, for those of you who take an interest in Canadian politics, I guess you could call it a juicy story. So before I explain what happened and ask our guests to chime in, the Green Party of Canada was invited initially to participate in the debates. And on Wednesday, hours before the first of the two debates, there was one on the French language on Wednesday night, Last night was in the English language. They were disinvited. And before I explain what happened, I just, in the interest of full disclosure, want to tell our audience, for those who don't know, I ran to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada in 2020, and I finished second out of 8 candidates with about 45% of the vote on the 8th and final ballot. The winner was Annamie Paul with 55% of the vote. Sadly for Annamie, she lasted only 1 year in the leader's position. I think that year could fairly be described as a calamitous year for the Green Party. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve into what happened. She replaced Annamie Paul, Elizabeth May, who had been the party's leader for 13 years when May resigned from the leadership in 2019. And when she resigned on national television, she was obliged to be completely neutral in the leadership contest. Instead of being neutral, however, she supported Annamie Paul. And you don't have to take my word for it. Elizabeth May said as much in an op-ed that she wrote for the Toronto Star in October 2021, which was entitled, "Annamie Paul told me to stay silent, but now I must say something." Now, after Annamie Paul resigned in 2021, the Green Party held another leadership contest in 2022, in which I did not run, but Elizabeth May did run. She came back, and this time she ran with a co-leader candidate by the name of Jonathan Pedneau, who really didn't have any, if any, prior history in the Green Party until then. And she ran with a co-leader, even though the Green Party's constitution made no allowance for co-leaders and envisioned only one person as leader. Eventually, in 2022, she won the most votes, and Jonathan Pedneau, whom she then characterized as her co-leader, finished third in that leadership contest with less than 10% of the vote. So as I mentioned, the Leaders Debate Commission initially invited the Greens, and before the Greens were disinvited, the Green Party announced that it would be Jonathan Pedneau who would represent the Green Party at the Leaders' Debates. And to help you to explain what happened here, I think first we have to show you what the criteria were for inclusion in the Leaders' Debates. And they're up on the screen there. You might not be able to read them, so I'm going to read them out loud to you. The political party, in order to be invited to the leadership debate, had to meet 2 of the following 3 criteria. Number 1, on the date the general election is called, the party is represented in the House of Commons by a member of Parliament. And now, the Green Party met that criterion because they had 2 members of Parliament. Number 2, 28 days before the date of the general election, the party receives a level of national support of at least 4%. At that point, the Green Party was polling below 4% and continues, as we showed you, to poll below 4%. So they didn't meet that criterion. So everything for the Green Party hinged on the third one. They had to meet the third one. And the third one is 28 days before the date of the general election, the party has endorsed candidates in at least 90% of federal ridings. And in this particular election, the number of ridings is 343. Now, 28 days before the election, the Green Party provided to the Canadian Electoral Commission a list of 343 candidates whom it said it had endorsed. So that's 100% of the ridings. However, it later emerged that Elections Canada had confirmed only 232 candidates for the Green Party, which is well below the 90% threshold. Initially, it looked as though the Debate Commission was going to allow the Green Party to participate anyways, but that all changed on April 15th, just a few days ago, when Jonathan Pedneau stated to the French language arm of the national broadcaster, the CBC, that the Green Party had withdrawn candidates from certain ridings to reduce the chances of the Conservative candidates winning in those ridings. At that point, the Debate Commission sought submissions from the Green Party about why it had withdrawn candidates and how many it had withdrawn. And after receiving those submissions, the Commission issued a decision on Wednesday, 2 days ago, to disinvite the Green Party. And we're just going to show you an excerpt from this decision. So what the key paragraph in that decision is as follows. The Commission concludes that in the circumstances in which the Green Party of Canada has intentionally reduced the number of candidates running an election for strategic reasons, it no longer meets the intention of the participation criteria to justify inclusion in the leaders' debates. Whether or not the Green Party of Canada intended to run 343 candidates, it has since made the strategic decision to reduce the number of candidates running, meaning that voters no longer have the opportunity to vote for those candidates. Deliberately reducing the number of candidates running for strategic reasons is inconsistent with the Commission's interpretation of party viability, which Criterion 3 was designed to measure. The Commission concludes that the inclusion of the leader of the Green Party of Canada in these circumstances would undermine the integrity of the debates and the interests of the voting public. Now, in a subsequent twist, Elizabeth May contradicted what Jonathan Pedneau told the media about the withdrawal of candidates from certain ridings. May told the press that contrary to Pedneau's claim that the party had withdrawn 15 candidates from 15 ridings for strategic reasons, that the party never in fact did that. And she said as follows, she was quoted in the CBC saying, "We never had any decision, nor did we strategically remove candidates from any seat. So given that it was a misunderstanding, we hope the Debates Commission will reconsider this." Now, I must tell you, there's no way to reconcile, in my opinion, what Jonathan Pedneau and Elizabeth May are saying, and I think they both know what the actual situation is. So one of them is being, in my opinion, less than honest. In any event, Alex, what do you make of all of this? What do you think has happened here? And as you know, a longtime member of the Green Movement, what is your feeling about all of this?
Well, basically, the federal party looks like it's completely in shambles, completely disorganized, unable to function, unable to be coherent. And so, first of all, okay, in the 9 months before the election, Pedneau was absent for 7 of those 9 months. Okay, he did not do the groundwork that's required for a general election campaign, which for the Green Party is mostly recruiting candidates. So they came up short.
I just want people to know, because they may not know, he resigned as co-leader and he came back. That's why he was absent for 7 months. So please continue. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. And even with that resignation, at the time that he resigned, he said that he had lost faith in party politics and partisanship, and he wrote an op-ed about that in Le Devoir. So he left. But then when he came back, he said it was for medical reasons. So there too, there's a little bit of, which one is it, right? Can you really just rewrite what happened to suit your current needs in terms of public relations? But basically, he wasn't there to do the work. He came back at the last minute, was named as co-leader without a leadership race, and then in some deal with Elizabeth, ended up sort of becoming the #1 leader of the party and going to the leaders' debates while only having received less than 10% in the previous leadership race, a leadership race which I was attempting to run for and was expelled because of my opposition to the war in Ukraine. So I'm a bit bitter about that whole situation, right? But with respect to being thrown out of the debates, like, it is unfortunate that the Green Party is thrown out, and I can just imagine the emotional roller coaster that Pedneau has been through, where you go to sleep after preparing for the debate, and you wake up the morning of the debate and you're thrown out. That's probably an unfortunate situation for anybody, right? And you can see the emotion in his statements. But then to come out and say that, no, but we did meet the criteria of 90% of a full slate, and playing on this little, splitting these hairs, saying that the criteria was to announce 1 month before the election a list of candidates, but that somehow those candidates didn't have to follow through and actually become candidates. Like, they lost over 100 people out of 343. So, like, what happened there? Why was that? And then to make things worse, when they're trying to explain it, they put out a press release actually last week saying that how their volunteers were being harassed in the streets, that people can't go to the shopping mall on behalf of the Green Party and get signatures because people are mean to them and they come back crying and stuff like that. Complete negative image to give to the party, right? Like, I've been involved in many elections. I've run 12 times for National Assembly, and every single time I've gone out there, there's been some people that are a little bit rude at the doorstep and stuff like that. And in every election, there's candidates that leave because of that. But to go out and say that we're so popular that we can't stand on, it was so unpopular we can't stand on the street corner, gave a bad image. Then they fell short of the candidates, and they're trying to find ways to explain it. But their politics and their PR approach is inherently dishonest, and they often tell these little lies to try and get themselves out of trouble. So they came up with a cover story that they pulled the candidates back to advantage other parties as a justification for why they didn't have the full slate. Well, that completely backfired, because when the commission was looking at this, they said, okay, well, you're short over 100 candidates, and now plus you say that it's not just a logistical problem or anything like that, but that you intentionally pulled them back. So they made the decision to kick them out at the last minute, and it's definitely putting that decision down the morning of the debate without any appeal process, without any means to build any kind of campaign to be let back in, was a kind of a shitty move, you know. But ultimately, I think that that criteria was fair. And not only that, but people might forget that this criteria was suggested by Elizabeth May herself, because back when they were debating like the creation of this debates commission, Elizabeth May submitted a proposal for what the criteria should be, okay? And that criteria is what the commission ended up retaining, and that's what's in force now. So back in 2016, Elizabeth found it perfectly reasonable to have to present a slate of 90%, a full slate of 90% or more in all the districts, and you know, to have 4% in the polls, or to have one MP. And you have to meet 2 out of these 3 criteria. They were proposed by Elizabeth, and they were designed to allow the Green Party to participate. So really, there's no excuse for these leadership failures that led to the decrease in number of candidates. And this decrease in number of candidates also coincides with really a sort of right-wing shift within the party towards militarism, support for war, tax cuts. There's a lot of really things that the Greens set out to oppose, like when they were founded, that have now become Green Party policy, right? And the argument for this has been the party will get more success if it goes to the center and if it waters down its message and if it goes along with the military agenda and all that, okay? The reality is that you still have to recruit candidates, and there's far fewer people that are willing to run for office in order to play this game of supporting warfare and stuff, compared to the number of people there are that are willing to run, but for good reasons, you know, for peace and social justice and environment, without playing the political game, without compromising, without selling out, okay? So they were not able to find enough people to go along with the shitty agenda that they're putting forward. And I feel that if they would have had a more progressive platform, and especially given the level of mobilization over the Palestine issue, they should have had no problem finding candidates. I don't see what the problem is.
Yeah. And, you know, this is the perfect segue, Alex, into the Green Party's foreign policy positions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we didn't have the benefit of hearing, because of all of these shenanigans, from the Green Party directly in the leaders' debate about foreign policy, which is obviously a focus of Reason to Resist. But we did have the benefit of a press conference that Jonathan Pedno held 1 week before the leaders' debates to announce the Green Party's platform for foreign policy. And our intrepid friend, Yves Engler, happened to be there and asked some pointed questions. This, if you could just stop it there, Rami. So this is Jonathan Pedno at the press conference, and Yves is he's in the Q&A's portion of the press conference about foreign policy, and Yves is about to ask him some questions.
And that is where the bloc should be focusing its efforts. C'est bon? Yes.
So just sort of a bit of a precision on your position on the fighter jets, because in 2021, I'm pretty sure Elizabeth May signed a public letter with Neil Young and Sarah Harmer and David Suzuki and Daryl Hannah and Noam Chomsky, people like that, saying no new fighter jets for Canada. So your position is not to put that money into combating the climate crisis or, you know, the social housing, but rather to just purchase in Canada or in Europe?
We need fighter jets. We need the ability to defend this country. The money should not be spent on US products. It should be spent on ensuring that workers here at home can have good jobs. We have a huge territory to defend from nations that right now, Yves, are attacking other countries. If you're suggesting that we simply kneel to that prospect, you're free to do that. Yeah.
And the follow-up question in a different direction, you talked about law and upholding international law, which of course is important. But so there's a whole bunch of Canadians, dozens of Canadians who've been fighting in Gaza, who joined the Israeli military and have been involved in what you refer to as a genocide. Canada has something called the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act.
They should be investigated.
They should be investigated. But then there's also the...
Do you have more questions?
Tied to that is that there's a whole bunch of institutions, including a school in Toronto, then a Kiva school, that a quarter of the students join the Israeli military after graduating.
I'm not familiar with those details.
But the point here is we have the Foreign Enlistment Act in this country that makes it illegal to induce Canadians to join any other country's military. Do you think that the RCMP and Canadian authorities should be investigating?
The RCMP should be upholding the law. The law applies to everyone.
Including Canadians fighting Israeli military.
The law applies to every Canadian. Merci.
Now, just that I hope that was loud enough for everybody to hear. But basically, Yves asked him, to reconcile his position that Canada should buy fighter jets with a letter that Elizabeth May signed not too long ago, opposing the expenditure of gigantic amounts of money on fighter jets. And then Yves asked him about the fact that there are Canadians, this is an established fact, Canadian citizens who are fighting in the genocidal war in Gaza. Yves, I didn't show the whole Q&A from that press conference, but my sense was that his tone changed when you asked him questions, and he seemed rather annoyed by your questions. Was that your sense as well?
It was way worse than that. When I entered the press conference, he basically attacked me before the press conference started. There was only Radio Canada was there. I was the only other journalist there. And right when I walk in the door, he's like, he makes some statement about how I don't like your type of journalism and but you can stay. So he was like totally hostile. And the second clip there that I shared of him very hostile to me, answering that they should uphold the law with Canadians fighting the Israeli military and the Foreign Enlistment Act. I share that on social media and it gets wide circulation. So I was actually like helping him out, right? So it was totally, I thought it was just unprofessional on his part, and it was dumb political tactics when, you're not, there's only one other media there. You want to have like left social media influencers, if you want to call us that, attending. And, one thing I was kind of, I guess, embarrassing him on the fighter jet question, but on the Palestine question, which got much more circulation, I was, kind of helping his PR out, but he was so kind of hostile. And this goes to the bigger question. You missed the whole, I had to listen to it in French and in English, his whole 7-minute intro about the Green Party foreign policy. And it was pretty stunning. I mean, it was stunning. I was taken aback at how bad it was. He was this whole, like, there's the Russia, China, and now the US, these superpowers that want to attack us. And we're under threat. We have to put money. We don't want F-35. So he did say we don't want F-35s, but we have to put money into fighter jets. We just got to be built here. We got to build up military. The whole ethos of it was this like really kind of like danger. Not that we have a danger of like Lytton, BC, or other communities that have been wiped out by forest fires. Not that we're in a danger of a climate crisis. It literally wiped communities off the map in the country in recent summers, but that we're in this crisis or in this danger threat of that Russia's going to come over the Arctic and that China is about to come however China is going to come. I mean, it's when you sit and think about it, it's stunningly ridiculous. Like even the U.S., like the U.S. is the only country that can invade Canada. Okay, but even the U.S., the chance of the U.S. being on the cusp of invading Canada is despite Trump's whatever, we're still very, very far from that. And we have other crises that are much more other threats that are much more present that we should be dealing with. But yeah, so his whole kind of ideological framework, he talks about international law, implying that China, Russia, and the U.S. are violating international law, I think there's that's correct with regards to the U.S. and Russia with regards to different wars. China has not been in any wars. He doesn't lump in Israel with violating international law in terms of active aggression, even though Israel is literally bombing Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, and let alone Gaza and what's going on the West Bank. So he doesn't add in Israel to that. He does do this sort of perfunctory that he mentions this as genocide. He says there should be a two-way arms embargo. I think that was all he said on Israel until I pushed him on the War Crimes Act. But the basics of his foreign policy, 7-minute foreign policy message was, it could have been Mark Carney delivering that. It could have been Jagmeet Singh delivering that. And it maybe not Polyev, but it could have been the other three delivering that message. There was essentially no real difference between the sort of overarching foreign policy vision that Pedno was putting out there. So, if he would have been on the debate stage, I don't know that it would have, changed anything when it came to a foreign policy discussion.
Yeah. You mentioned, Alex, that you were barred from running in the 2021 Green Party of Canada leadership contest because of your stance on Ukraine. So this is an issue you're well familiar with, and you've been outspoken about it. And as you know, Alex, I'm sure Yves knows this as well, Pedno in May changed the Green Party's policy about sending weapons to Ukraine right after May won the leadership contest in 2022 and declared her co-leader to be Jonathan Pedno. Up until that point in time, the interim leader, the one who was put in place as a stopgap, Amita Kutner, in between Annamie Paul and the winner of the 2022 leadership contest, took a clear, unambiguous position consistent with the Green Party's core values, which include nonviolence, against sending weapons to Ukraine. So they changed that. And they seem to have bought in. I mean, as Yves, I think, explained very well, they seem to have bought into this notion that Russia's going to come pouring across the Arctic Circle and invade Canada. Now, to be fair to Pedno, in responding to Yves' question, he didn't name any country, but I think we all know that when he talked about countries out there that are invading other countries, he wasn't talking about Israel invading Canada. He wasn't talking about that. He was talking about Russia and possibly also China. So my question to you is, Alex, is this a realistic fear? Do you think that it's sensible for us to be formulating foreign policy based on an assumption that Russia is planning to invade Canada?
No, I think it's completely absurd. And really, the Green Party in this election has completely shifted to fear-based politics. Every time they talk about foreign policy, every time they talk about the United States, they're talking about a big catastrophe, the apocalypse is just about to come. Jonathan Pedno has gone as far as to say that Canada should be inspired by Ukrainian resistance and that we should mirror that. In Ukraine, they went out and they gave the civilian population, AK-47s and said, shoot as many Russians as you can. Okay, so the fact that Pedno is saying this, that we should arm the population to fight against this imminent invasion, while also saying that, yeah, we need to increase military spending. He's talking about an additional 120,000 troops. When he talks about giving opportunities to young people, it's joining the military and learning firearms and that kind of thing. So it's completely absurd. And it's a complete mirror of the Liberal policy. Mark Carney, after being sworn in as Prime Minister, went up to Nunavut and announced his intention to beef up the military presence there and to construct a new military base and all this sort of thing. Well, 2 weeks later, Pedno goes up to the Arctic and makes essentially the exact same announcement. So they're constantly playing this fear-based politics, trying to make us afraid. And really, it's the same thing that the Canadian government is doing, and trying to get us to, extort the taxpayer for more weapons and stuff like that based on this fear narrative. And it's completely the opposite of what the Green Party should stand for. This thing has been hijacked, and it's very similar to the situation with Annamie Paul. Both Annamie Paul and Jonathan Pedno were put into their positions by Elizabeth May. Okay, both of them had spent most of their adult life outside of the country. Okay, they're parachuted in here. They're both born here and everything, but they did their whole professional career abroad. They show up here, and then all of a sudden they take the Green Party and start radically supporting Israel, radically supporting NATO, radically supporting increased military spending. So something is really weird in the Green Party. And even Pedno, when he was initially named by Elizabeth as deputy leader or co-leader, he had taken at times a few positions saying that, well, weapons is not what's going to solve the crisis in Ukraine. And at one point, he had speculated that Ukraine could even invade Russia. And for saying this, he was reprimanded by Elizabeth May and the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress. They went into some back room, and then they come out of this thing, and suddenly Pedno is apologizing for what he's saying, supporting the export of weapons to Ukraine, and has taken a completely hardline position since that. It's almost as if they took this sort of anti-weapons position briefly just to get the attention of the Ukrainian lobby, and as a way of saying, like, don't take our support for granted. And they made some sort of arrangement, and now the Green Party is 100% Ukraine. Actually, Elizabeth May is doing this entire campaign with a Ukrainian pin of the ribbon, like sort of like support the troops type of pin. She worn it every single day at every single appearance throughout the entire campaign. Meanwhile, if they're so concerned about Canada being invaded, why not wear the Canadian flag? Like, why go and every single event you go to announce your support for a proxy war that's pushed by NATO to weaken Russia and to benefit the arms production industry? Even Pedno is saying, oh, we want arms and we want them made here instead of the United States. Like, we don't need the fighter jets. And even Elizabeth May with Neil Young and Roger Waters and other celebrities had signed a thing, not saying we don't want F-35s, that we don't want any fighter jets, as Yves had mentioned that he questioned about. So it's a complete flip-flop. I don't understand how these things can change so quickly in the Green Party, and that the party can be so explicitly in favor of the military and of military spending.
Yeah, and on the question of the genocide in Gaza, as Yves mentioned, and to his credit, Pedno did acknowledge that Israel was committing genocide, which has become beyond obvious at this stage to any person with a functioning brain. But at the same
Elizabeth
time,
May does not use that word, eh? If you look very carefully, she never said the word genocide in the House of Commons. And although the party has used it on some statements, there's no quote that's ever been attributed directly to Elizabeth May about calling it a genocide. And none of the people from the Green Party have called for any meaningful economic sanctions on Israel.
and she went to the Israeli embassy. I mean, this just blows my mind. Her co-leader acknowledges what is obvious to anybody with an ounce of common sense, that this is a genocide. And she goes to the Israeli embassy last October to commemorate the deaths of Israelis on October 7th. Now, I'm not going to take issue with somebody who wants to, stand in solidarity with civilians who were killed on October 7th. But there are plenty of ways you can do that without going to the damn Israeli embassy, which has basically become a mouthpiece for a genocidal damn regime. You could go and, have a solemn ceremony with anti-Zionist, humanitarians who want to stand in solidarity with civilians who were killed in that day. Why would you go to the Israeli embassy when you know, and your co-leader is admitting that they represent a genocidal regime? It just blows my mind.
But it's not just the fact that she went to the embassy, it's the written statement that she put out that day on her parliamentary letterhead, in which she said, the bell that tolls the loudest is for those who died on October 7th. Okay, so how come that the deaths of those several hundred people on October 7th are more significant than the tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been killed since then and before? I mean, it's Jewish supremacy to say that those lives, although there's a smaller number of them, are more significant, that the bell tolls louder for them than for the Palestinians. Completely absurd. And I know, Dimitri, that you denounced it, and Elizabeth has deleted this statement since, but she hasn't apologized for it, and she hasn't provided an explanation for why she deleted it. Her staff told me no comment. They have nothing to say about it. And on the other hand, she tries to play like the pro-Palestine side, and she did like a hunger strike for a day or something like that. But it's completely inconsistent. And I don't see what it is that's stopping any of these people from calling for sanctions. Paul Manley is the only one that's running a strong campaign that has a chance of winning for Green Party that's called for sanctions. And I don't see what's holding Elizabeth back.
And I would just go one step. I don't think it's just. I think the sanctions question is steps removed. Have you seen anything on them saying that Canadian registered charities shouldn't be sending $500 million a year to projects in Israel? Before we get to sanctions, why is Canada offering this special subsidy to Israel, including to projects that support the Israeli military, that support settlements in the West Bank, that support racist organizations, that violate Canada Revenue Agency rules? Elizabeth's been basically absent on all that. The Jewish National Fund lost its charitable status back in 2013. Elizabeth went to a Jewish National Fund fundraiser where I was outside in Ottawa with about 100 other people protesting that fundraiser. They haven't raised that. I think when I have to go and ask Petitneau a comment about upholding the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act or the Foreign Enlistment Act vis-a-vis Israel, why didn't the Greens put out a statement on that? Why? Like there's and a whole bunch of other areas. So yes, they've come on board with the arms embargo once it's become a big issue. Petitneau maybe refers to genocide, whether Elizabeth doesn't. But Elizabeth also has done all this stuff, like when the football, the whole brouhaha about the Maccabi football anti-Semitism incident in Amsterdam back in November. She joins the whole distortion of that incident and plays right into Netanyahu and the Israeli government's hand. And so she continues to do this business of giving sops to the Israel lobby. And the real question, one of the questions I have on this is, leaving aside the morality of it, and obviously it's the horrors of what's happening in Gaza. The idea that you're involved in federal politics and you're not working at undermining every different form of Canadian support to Israel. Ultimately sanctions, but before we get to sanctions, all these special deals we give, the Canadians of Fight, the trade agreement, the registered charities, the violating of the arms trade treaty, on and on. Okay, the whole list of things that was special relationship to Israel. Is this good politics? Like, is it actually good for the Green Party? There's tens of thousands of people demonstrating. There's a whole there's a movement there that the Green Party could try to capture, and to take some of that energy and to be part of, and to get candidates, as Alex was mentioning before, based upon in part. So just from an actual strategic, let alone the morality side of it, from a strategic standpoint, I think you can make a very good case that the Green Party, that's certainly this wishy-washy throw bones towards Jewish supremacy that Elizabeth May is doing, is dumb, I think, strategically. But more further than that, to go full in and to go hard in and say, hey, yeah, we are going to be the party of this movement opposing genocide. We're going to try to, really amplify that and get very heavily involved. That has Green Party flags at every demonstration, et cetera. We're going to put it out on our list. We're going to, recruit candidates from that movement, et cetera, et cetera. I think that makes sense, but there's a block. Clearly, there's a block ideologically with Elizabeth May. I think Elizabeth May is actually a Christian Zionist. She has a theological background on this stuff. And there's also this fear of the anti-Semitism label. There's a fear of the pushback from the pro-Israel organized lobby, and so they don't even make the right calculation, let alone the right moral calculation, the right political calculation for the party itself.
Yeah, Yves, you make a really important point. I mean, I made this argument back in 2016 when I was in her shadow cabinet as the justice critic, and I brought forward a resolution supporting PDS. I said, look, I had private conversations with her because she was freaking out. Oh my God, we're going to get attacked by the lobby because you're asking the party's members to support BDS, which they ultimately did over her objections, by the way. But as I showed at the outset, the Green Party is currently polling at 3%. 3%. The polls show that the proportion of Canadians, adult Canadian voters, who feel really strongly about what Israel is doing to Palestine is way, way in excess of 3%. And at this point, it could be, if not a majority, certainly a large majority. So there's this huge pool of voters out there who really care about this issue in Canada. And, Elizabeth May, by trying to play both sides of the fence, on the one hand, saying there should be a two-way arms embargo, on the other hand, going to the genocidal embassy and hanging out with those war criminals, she's basically alienating that voter bloc. It just makes, to me, absolutely no sense. And like you, Yves, I can only think that it's a combination of fear and ideology, Christian Zionism ideology. In any event, since we're now on the subject of Israel, I want to go to the leaders' debate, and we're going to start with the discussion about Gaza at this debate. And now, before we get into it, I just want to remind people, who they may know, they may not know, that I have recently been I've been referring quite frequently to the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, as the yapping Zionist Chihuahua. Could you please add, well, we can do it here. There it is. We had this image made up especially for this is not an actual attire that Pierre Poilievre wore, but this, I think, aptly symbolizes his views about Israel and Palestine. He literally is just a mouthpiece for the government of Israel. Now, I think I can make my point quite persuasively, if you'll bear with me and watch Pierre Poilievre respond to a question about Gaza at the debate.
5 minutes for it here. What role should Canada play in the other major international crisis in this world, in the Middle East and the war in Gaza? Pierre Poilievre, would you start us off on that? What role can Canada play?
Well, first of all, we must condemn Hamas and, more importantly, the terror sponsors in Tehran who initiated the attacks, the horrific attacks of October 7th. We need to defeat the terrorists so that all the peoples of the world can live in peace and defend the right of, yes, Palestinians to have their own lives free from the oppression of Hamas dictators and Iranian intervention, while Israel has the ability to live in freedom and peace. But I also want to say we need to get back to the Canadian tradition, which is that when people come to this country, they leave foreign conflicts behind. The rampaging riots targeting Jewish communities is utterly unacceptable, and it points to the growing chaos that we see on our streets after 10 years of incredibly irresponsible liberal policies, of weak borders, of dividing people into groups, of saying one thing to one group and the opposite to another, dividing and conquering. We must end that division and unite our people so that everyone feels safe, and that when we come here, we put our foreign conflicts behind and we put Canada first.
Now, I know, Yves and Alex, that you have been to probably at this stage dozens of pro-Palestinian protests since this god-awful monstrosity began in October of 2022. Have you been to or witnessed or become aware of a rampaging riot? Just one?
Well, I went to a protest that was organized around the NATO summit in Montreal, where a lot of people used that protest and what happened there in a similar way to the Amsterdam soccer incident and all that. Basically, what happened was there was a group of protesters that were there, and we were marching, and there was a couple windows that were broken, but the police used tear gas to try and disperse the protesters. And the tear gas canisters carry a fire risk. And one of them landed in a car, and the car caught fire. But Pierre Poilievre put the blame for this car fire and this vandalism on Hamas supporters and all that. And was saying, like, Montreal is burning and all this. Meanwhile, it was like a little protest confrontation that lasted maybe 20 minutes. But it was actually the police that lit the car on fire. And, Justin Trudeau was condemning like anti-Semitic, like hate mobs in the street and all that. So basically these people condemn things in their own country that did not even take place. And even the city of Montreal, despite the fact that the media has reported that the police canister landed in this car, and the police themselves had said, well, we're not certain anymore that's the protesters that lit the fire, we have to look into it more. They've never bothered to correct the record. So even, Trudeau, Melanie Joly, the mayor of Montreal, none of them had the courage to set the record straight and say that those events did not actually take place. So these people are kind of living in a parallel universe where they invent these whole stories about protests and riots that are not actually accurate. Like, if you would base your understanding of the situation on what Trudeau and Melanie Joly were saying, like, you would think that that people were chanting "death to Jews" and stuff like that in the streets. Completely ridiculous there. It's people coming out to protest against the genocide, okay, to protest against the actions of the Israeli government. And they try, and the right wing tries to twist this around and manipulate it and put these false narratives out there. So that's what's kind of tricky and sometimes difficult for the movement to respond to, when you're almost like defending stuff that did not actually take place.
Yeah, I've been to more than.
I just want to, could you let us know first, in answering my question, have you been to any quote unquote rampaging riots or learned of any? And quite apart from that, what are your thoughts about Poilievre's answer?
I've been to at least 100 demos, and including the NATO one. That would be something that could be closest to the quote unquote rampaging riot. I had my daughter, who was 2 and a bit, at that demo, just to give it context. It was a more let's call it heady demo than the others. Basically, all the other ones, there's nothing beyond people marching in the street. There's like nothing even close to the portrayal that Poilievre is putting out there. I have to say also with this NATO demo, it's important to note, like, I've been going to demos in Montreal for 25 years, and there is actually and this is more of what the NATO demo was. It was organized by CLAC, the Convergence de Lutte Anticapitaliste, which is a group that's gone back 25 years, involved in the sort of an anarchist group focused on the corporate globalization, and there were demonstrations in the early 2000s that, many demonstrations where windows were broken, and there is a somewhat of a tradition of that outside of the hockey, or outside of the Montreal Canadiens winning and losing, where there's riots. That's the most common one, but there is some degree of that. It has very little to do with Israel. It is fair to say that the NATO demo was bigger because with the NATO summit here in Montreal, that the demo was bigger because it so happened to coincide with a student strike on Palestine, and obviously these movements kind of merged together to some degree. But yeah, I mean, it was not like there was nothing anti-Semitic about it. There were some windows busted at the convention center where the NATO summit was being held. The cops were involved in, most of the violence still in this case was obviously the cops. People were put to hospital. Multiple people went to hospital because of police violence. The police also almost certainly caused the fires that were blamed on the protesters. So yeah, the whole thing is a fraud. And it's, there's a whole movement, a social media movement that Poilievre is clearly quite aligned with, that is about portraying any opposition to Israel's Holocaust in Gaza as being, these Islamists that need to be deported, or obviously anti-Semitic is the main thing, and they just go on and on and on of that. And now we have to the point where Poilievre is like publicly announcing he's going to copy Donald Trump, and we're going to start, expelling international students, non-citizen people on visas, because they don't like Israel killing Palestinian babies. And so there is this huge 18 months of organized authoritarian push by Zionist organizations and proponents of Israel. And, that's Poilievre, that culminates in Poilievre's ridiculous statements, and also even, more dangerous, his actual stated policy aims of copying Donald Trump and throwing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms down the drain, so Israel can kill more Palestinians.
Right. So let's see how Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, the nominally left-wing party, and the former Goldman Sachs banker, as I'm fond of calling him, Mark Carney, responded to the same question. We're going to start with Jagmeet Singh. And I'll ask you to comment after I show both of these clips.
Countries from around the world, and they care deeply about where they come from, and they should be able to do so. That's a part of being in our country, to have that freedom. Your treatment of Palestinians has been frankly disgusting. Your treatment of people who provide care and service for people in Gaza has been disgusting. On top of that, people in Israel and in Palestine deserve to live in peace and security. And Mr. Carney, to date, you've not acknowledged that what's going on in Gaza is now clearly become a genocide. It's important to call things out as they are, and you've not done that.
Mr. Carney.
Now, I just want to say before I ask you to comment, I want to show Carney before I ask you to comment this. I have to commend Jagmeet Singh. I've criticized him on other matters. When he used the word disgusting to describe Pierre Poilievre's treatment of Palestinians, he was absolutely correct. That was entirely appropriate language. You could have also fairly described it as psychopathic and genocidally racist. But disgusting, I'll take disgusting. And that was the only time, even though Gaza came up numerous times, that was the only time that anybody used the word genocide during that entire, 90-minute to 2-hour debate to describe what was going on in Gaza. So here's Carney's answer.
To go to your question, we need to work with our international partners, maximum pressure, maximum encouragement for an immediate ceasefire. That's the first thing. Encourage the return of all of the hostages. Resumption of humanitarian aid. My government put in place $100 million of humanitarian aid, which is ready to go. With respect to where this ultimately goes, yes, two-state solution, but it has to be a viable and free Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security with the state of Israel. I will underscore one other thing. Mr. Poilievre rightly mentioned Iran, the Iranian sponsors in this region. We have to be clear-eyed about the fundamental risks of Iran and do everything with our international partners to check it and turn it.
Just hold those words in your mind for a moment. To check it and turn it in Iran. I just want to park Iran for a second. We'll come back to that. Okay. Let's start with you, Alex. And by the way, that Carney's answer came after Jagmeet Singh used the word genocide. And no one responded to that allegation, including Poilievre. And Poilievre never responded to the assertion that his treatment of Palestinians is disgusting, which I thought was telling. Never tried to defend himself. In any case, Alex, what is your take on Carney's answer to the question?
I think that Carney is, a force for evil in this whole thing, because there's no reason that Canada can't call this a genocide. At one point, there was a heckler who said something, it's a genocide. Carney seemed to sort of acknowledge it without saying the word himself, but then was quickly called to order by Benjamin Netanyahu and completely backtracked. So it's really unfortunate, where a lot of people would think that Canada should be a voice for peace in the world, that we should be fighting against racism and the killing of innocent civilians and women and children, and really staggering numbers. Israel, knocking down entire cities, killing people indiscriminately, and this rhetoric, even like about Hamas, like people saying that, when they're asked about the Middle East, first thing, Hamas is terrorist, we have to condemn it and all that. Like, it's just another way to justify the actions of the Israeli government by using the terrorist label for Hamas. It's a way to dehumanize the Palestinian people by saying that their leadership is terrorist and illegitimate and all this sort of thing. So it's really unfortunate to see like the genocidal rhetoric coming through the mouths of many of the politicians on that stage. And it's great that Jagmeet was able to, have that moment, but has he called for sanctions? Not to my knowledge, right? So all of these,
he's like the Green Party. He's called for an arms embargo.
An arms embargo is not enough. There needs to be
absolutely.
economic sanctions, in my view, against the entire state of Israel. I mean, look at all of those sanctions that they applied to Russia, to Iran, to other countries. Like, why is it that we apply all of these sanctions there, okay, and we say, we're going to completely cut Russia out of the global economy and all this, yet Canada continues to do business with Israel? Like, there's a major problem there. And the fact that the debate stage is filled with this genocidal rhetoric, a little bit of criticism about it, but with no calls for serious economic sanctions, says a lot about Canadian foreign policy, and it says a lot about how closely tied we are with the U.S. empire and our unwillingness of the people that are in charge of Canada to break away from that empire and develop an independent foreign policy that's actually grounded in human rights.
Before you respond, I'm just going to ask you to focus on one thing, but please don't feel limited by this. I'd just like you to address one thing in your answer. You heard him refer to the two-state solution. We've been hearing this mantra of the two-state solution from liberals for 50 years. And, also the conservatives used to say two-state solution. They used to mouth that phrase, but now they don't even do that much. You didn't hear Poilievre say two-state solution. They won't even mouth that mantra anymore. So what is your thought about this, invocation of the two-state solution? But more broadly, what's your reaction to?
I mean, Carney also a week ago said that he wasn't going to follow Emmanuel Macron and recognize Palestine. So I think it's 147 countries that have recognized Palestine. So he talks about a two-state solution, but he won't recognize one of those states. I mean, it's a joke, of course. It's just a mantra that means nothing. I mean, even recognizing Palestine doesn't mean that much. It's mostly just symbolic, but at least it's symbolic in a certain direction. And he's not willing to do that. So I think that the Iran question, I think, is interesting that he went out of his way to bring the Iran. In the French debate, his kind of response on the Palestine pushing from Jagmeet, I would say seemed less bad than it was in English. Invoking Iran is you're trying to obviously exculpate Israel, but you're also setting up towards further aggression against Iran. And the fact that he wanted to go that route, Carney clearly planned to do that. It probably a little bit different, chose to go a little different messaging in French versus English, which is not that surprising because it's generally be viewed as a little bit more pro-Palestinian in the French language world than in the English language world. Now, I do think that the Jagmeet Singh element is interesting and important, and it obviously shouldn't be. Jagmeet Singh has been a complete and utter coward on Palestine, and he has, the most infamous thing.
Tell us what you really think.
Yeah, infamous in 2021. He just before the NDP convention, where there was some resolutions upholding Palestinian rights and opposing the anti-Palestinian IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, he did an interview with CBC where he was asked about these resolutions about Palestine, and he talked about anti-Semitism 5 times, and he never used the word Palestinian, and it was so over the top in its deference to apartheid state that it led to a big backlash, and it actually ultimately maybe was even a good thing he did this, because it sort of spiraled activism within the party that forced them to finally accept this Palestine resolution, which the NDP conventions had been blocking for basically 20 years, suppressing members from voting democratically at the convention to express opposition to apartheid. So, Hélène Lavadière, his first foreign affairs minister, went to AIPAC summit in Washington, D.C. She went to the Jewish National Fund event when she was on a trip in Israel. There's just a whole expelling candidates. Probably it's over a dozen, maybe more, that different candidates. Someone like Paul Manley was expelled, wasn't allowed to run. I guess that was actually pre-Jagmeet Singh, but during Jagmeet Singh's time, all kinds of candidates not allowed to run because they said Palestinians were human beings and stuff like that. So there's a whole history, and then there's a longer history of deep Zionism within the NDP. Thomas Mulcair said, "I support Israel in all situations and all circumstances." That's the predecessor, the leader before Jagmeet Singh. Then you have people like Stephen Lewis did all these egregious anti-Palestinian. Tommy Douglas was a wild Zionist going back to the 1970s. So there's a long history. Singh going out of his way in both the French debate and the English debate to politicize the genocide, to put it on Carney that he won't use the word, that he sort of flip-flopped because he sort of suggested it was a genocide, as Alex mentioned when a heckler raised the question. So to go out of his way to try to seek political gain from using the word genocide and putting it on Carney, I think is kind of important in the history of Canadian foreign policy in general, but obviously more specifically in the history of the Palestine question within Canada. Obviously, we're seeing all the NDP candidates, the vast majority of NDP candidates, all wanting to sign the Vote for Palestine pledge during this election, and that the Vote for Palestine pledge is not particularly radical, but it is clearly going in a certain direction. We're seeing people like Nikki Ashton, a left NDP MP, raising the charity question quite regularly. I get emails from her. I mean, probably a dozen over the past 8-10 months, raising the charity question. We're seeing other, indications of that. It's not where it should be, not even close to where it should be, but it is quite significant in terms of a shift in the history of NDP support for Zionism. It's a break. It's going to be hard to go, to go backwards on this. Other thing I would say that I found kind of interesting. I haven't looked in the past 18 hours, but I looked about 20 hours after Singh had done this in French and pushed on genocide, and there was silence from CIJA, silence from B'nai B'rith, silence from Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. They didn't put anything on their Twitter accounts, even though they posted about other things. So I conclude from that, they may now have responded since it came back up in the English debate, and they care more about the English debate. But I sort of take from that they understand now that it's not electoral to make a big kerfuffle about NDP raising the word genocide or Singh raising the word genocide. That would just benefit the NDP. That would just hurt Mark Carney. And so the Israel lobby groups are taking a fairly soft, a cautious kind of pushback on this, when in fact in the past they would have yelled anti-Semitism on the debate stage or whatever. They would have done their so I think that's also interesting in terms of seeing the shift. And again, this is a reaction to the massive protests, including that 20,000 people marching in Ottawa after 18 months of hundreds of demos last weekend. There still is this mobilized movement against Canada's complicity in Israel's genocide.
Yeah. I want to move next to the other main foreign policy issue, which is the Ukraine war. Before I do that, I want to comment on Iran. In the debate, we don't have time to show you all of it, but both, as you saw, both Carney and Poilievre talked about this Iran menace. They didn't mention that the threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence agencies for 2025, which came out a few weeks ago, says that Iran is not seeking to develop a nuclear weapon. Said nothing about that. They didn't mention the fact that Israel has nukes. They didn't mention the fact that Israel is the only country in West Asia that hasn't signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They didn't mention the fact that the United States, our closest ally, is the only country that ever used these weapons of mass destruction and did so on civilian populations. They didn't mention the fact that Trump pulled the United States out of the Obama-era nuclear deal, which the International Atomic Energy Agency said Iran was respecting. They didn't mention any of that. And they didn't even have the decency to do something which the Trump administration itself does, and that is say, we hope we can avoid war. They didn't even say that. All that Carney said was, we want to, those words, turn and check Iran. What the hell does that mean? What is your position on bombing Iran? Do you have a position on bombing Iran? Do you have an appreciation about how close we are to a war with Iran and how calamitous that would be for the whole world, including Canada? I mean, they didn't say anything about the possibility of war with Iran, not any of these candidates. They all took the time to trash Iran without recognizing any of the points that I made and said zero, all four of them, about the possibility of war with Iran. And I believe that in his foreign policy press conference, Jonathan Pedneau did not express any concern about the policy, the possibility of war with Iran. And so I just want to raise that. But before, I'm not going to ask you guys to weigh in, because I want you to weigh in on the Ukraine commentary that they made, and we don't have enough time to cover all of these things. So here's, first of all, what Carney and Jagmeet Singh had to say about the Ukraine war and supporting Ukraine.
Ukraine surely constitutes a crisis, leading in a time of crisis. Mr. Poilievre, question for you. If the United States withholds support from Ukraine going forward, do you believe Canada should commit more to assist?
I believe we should continue to support Ukraine. Our party supported donating missiles that the Canadian military was decommissioning. We supported funds and other armaments to back the Ukrainians in the defense of their sovereignty. We also need to rebuild our own Canadian military because the Russians want to make incursions into our waters. We'll be buying 4 massive Arctic icebreakers. I'll be opening the first Arctic base since the Cold War in Canada, CFB Iqaluit. We're going to double the size of the Arctic Rangers and fill the vacancies in our Canadian armed forces. We need a change to rebuild our military, which has been so disintegrated under the cuts and the mismanagement of the last 10 years. But we can have a change because we have the best soldiers, sailors, and airmen in the world, and they will have full backing from my government if you give me the honor of becoming Prime Minister.
I may come back to that one in the open forum
Thank
because
you.
I'm not sure we got an answer about Ukraine on that one, but okay.
Well,
Going on. Monsieur Blanchet.
the answer was yes.
We'll get more details, perhaps, as we go forward. Mr. Blanchet, given the U.S. trade war, should any talk of a referendum on Quebec independence be put on pause?
That one is easy. It will happen only after the negotiation is over, and that's a good thing. I want to say I support the idea we must help Ukraine, but we also must help the civilians of Gaza, and we must destroy Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. You know,
Okay, that was the only time, by the way, that Blanchet ever mentioned Gaza. That was it. So you've heard from Blanchet, the Bloc leader, and Poilievre on supporting Ukraine. And by the way, I don't think that that moderator was fair to Poilievre. I think he said very clearly that he thinks that Canada should continue sending weapons to Ukraine. So I don't know why he said that Poilievre didn't answer the question. But anyways, here's what Carney and Jagmeet Singh had to say about supporting Ukraine.
You wanted to add?
Well, I want to go to the situation in Ukraine because it's very important. We've been a steadfast, Canada has been a steadfast ally, and Canadians have stepped up, welcoming Ukrainians into their homes and supporting them in other ways. You know, in my first month as Prime Minister, we joined the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine as the U.S. stepped back. So led by France, the United Kingdom, with Ukraine, number of European nations, Australia, ourselves, New Zealand. That's an example of how the new world is going to be. Canada participating in these areas and helping. It also means open trade. Mr. Poilievre voted against free trade agreement with Ukraine. It means aid for Ukraine. Mr. Poilievre wants to cut foreign aid, including for Ukraine, or not. He didn't mention support for aid for Ukraine. We have to stand by them. We have to be there, and this government has been.
Mr. Singh.
New Democrats absolutely support standing with Ukraine and will continue to do that. But I appreciate the opportunity.
So, Poilievre, Carney, Yves-François Blanchet, Jagmeet Singh, and Jonathan Pedneau, every single one of them, want us to send more weapons to Ukraine. None of them ever asked the question, what is going to happen if we keep sending weapons to Ukraine? Is Ukraine actually going to be able to use those weapons to expel Russian forces from its territory? Or is Ukraine going to end up getting destroyed and end up losing even more territory? None of them even asked the question. What is your take on this unanimity about fueling this proxy war, gentlemen? Well, I'll start with you, Alex, because you were barred from the leadership contest because of your position on this issue. Why don't you tell us how you respond to this unanimity?
I think that it shows how crazy Canadian foreign policy is when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, at the outset of the invasion, Justin Trudeau was ready for the no-fly zone in the first week. He was ready to escalate it to World War III like 3 years ago, right? And what's really unfortunate is that there's no substantive opposition to that in Canadian politics. And, you know, it seemed that for the Green Party, having just one candidate in their leadership race that was against that war was unacceptable, right? So I was expelled from that. You know, at a time when I had a good chance at coming first or second place, I think, in that leadership race. But, you know, these people are all living in this bubble of sort of NATO propaganda. They think that maybe the Ukraine will somehow win this war. They romanticized this idea. And the thing is, it's not grounded in reality. It's been obvious since the beginning that if Ukraine entered into an armed conflict with Russia, that the consequences would be devastating for Ukraine. That's exactly what we've seen over the past 3+ years. And nobody in Canadian politics is willing to acknowledge that. They're all going down this route of just sending more sanctions, more weapons, more military equipment. Like, this will get Ukraine absolutely nowhere. And what's even unfortunate is that at times Trump has talked about peace with Ukraine, right, and with Russia, and we can debate about the sincerity and whether it's realistic what he's saying or not. But Jagmeet Singh even has condemned Trump for that, right, calling Trump, oh, he's too close with Putin and this kind of thing. So not only are they not willing to call for peace talks themselves, but they ridicule other people who do, and really try and completely close the door to any kind of negotiated solution to the end of this war. So, Canadians are looking at this debate where every single option is for war. There's no anti-war option that's a major party that's present in all parts of the country. People have absolutely no choice, no matter who they vote for. Amongst these 5 big parties, they're going to be endorsing the war in Ukraine. And I think that there's a huge political void in Canada. The United States, Jill Stein was very outspoken against the war in Ukraine. And I think that it says a lot about the state of Canadian politics that there's not a single party leader that's willing to take a reasonable stand on this issue.
Yeah, and Cornel West was also opposed in the United States. And by the way, for those who don't know, the European Green Party leaders and Elizabeth May wanted Jill Stein, who was opposed to this depraved proxy war, to drop out because they thought wrongly that her presence in the race was going to contribute to a Donald Trump victory. Even if everybody who voted for Jill Stein switched their vote to Kamala Harris still would have lost. In any event, Yves, I know you're short on time. What's your take on this unanimity for the proxy war?
Yeah, I mean, it's been this way more or less since the get-go. And none of these people are willing to mention Canada's role in ousting Yanukovych in 2014. None of these people are willing to mention the fact that Canada began a low-level proxy war with Russia back in 2015 when we instigated Operation Unifier, where we were training Ukrainian forces that were involved in fighting forces that were assisted by Russia. And so we basically had a low-level proxy war for 10 years now. They don't talk about any of the broader context of Canada promoting, goes back to Jean Chrétien promoting NATO expansion, knowing that this was provocative from a Russian perspective. Canadian officials knew this. Harper pushed it in 2008. This was known. This was reported on. I mean, the Canadian embassy in Kyiv was used as a base of opposition, including by the far right C-14 during the protests against Yanukovych that ousted him. All this has been, it's in the public domain. It's been reported on it. None of the politicians want to talk about any of that context. And the supposed pro-Ukraine position is just to keep giving more and more weapons so the war can go on for more and more time, which the current result and likely continued result is going to be ever more lost territory from Ukraine's perspective, while simultaneously killing more and more of the male population that's already a declining population. And it's all pretty grim. I mean, and I think when you look at Gaza and in the situation where it's really simple. It's just 100-year colonial movement committing a horrible massacre, day in, day out genocide, and you can't even get opposition to that. Then a situation like Ukraine, where it's actually is more complicated. I mean, I do believe Russia did invade in an aggressive manner. They're obviously responding to this NATO expansionism and all this belligerent geopolitical posturing, aggressiveness from Canada, U.S. and others. And so, yeah, in that context, you can't get any pushback. And the Polyev thing, the answer that Polyev did is I think somewhat interesting, because there is clearly a segment, the only segment where there seems to be any pushback on the NATO proxy war, with the exception of like the far off fringes of the peace movement. The only where there's pushback is some of the kind of what's been the kind of pro-Trump MAGA-ish kind of world that Polyev represents to some extent. So he doesn't actually want to talk about putting more and more money into Ukraine. He wants to do it. He will do it, but he doesn't want to talk about it too much because it does alienate a segment of his base. And so that's why he went with the one quick answer, yes, and then talked about a safer area, which was, building up the Canadian military. So that's interesting, but it's also interesting to see the reaction of the moderator, which is to like hype this up as like a really big like problem with Polyev, that he's not willing to be like over the top and we will, continue to the last weapon we can send, and this kind of thing. So it speaks to the media climate, and of course the media climate has been somewhat critical of Polyev for not being 100% behind the NATO proxy war. But it speaks to the overarching political ethos, which is we live in a country that is deeply, deeply pro-NATO. There is almost no questioning of NATO, and even when it's, of course, an alliance that bombed Libya, bombed Serbia, it's a belligerent alliance. It's been a belligerent alliance since the get-go, since 1949, when Canada was involved in setting it up. It was designed to be a tool of imperialism, to be a tool of maintaining European colonial domination in Africa, in Asia and Vietnam and places like that. And Canada's been backing it, had troops stationed in Europe for 40 years under NATO, and continues to be a staunch proponent of an alliance that never should have existed, certainly shouldn't have existed after the end of the Warsaw Pact, and definitely needs to be done away with today.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add to your excellent observations, both of you, is that, as we mentioned, both Pedno, the Green Party co-leader, and Jagmeet Singh support sending weapons to Ukraine. They both acknowledge that Israel is committing genocide, but they have not ever whispered and would never dream of suggesting that we should send weapons to the Palestinians. That is verboten, even just to raise it as a possibility. But rah, let's send weapons to Ukraine. Now, Yves, I know you got to go. There were a number of domestic policy issues we were going to take up. I don't think we're going to have time to do that because we do want to have a little bit of Q&A before we sign off today. But I'm going to ask you, Yves, to stick with me for just one domestic policy issue, because you are uniquely positioned to respond to it. And that is Jagmeet Singh's comments on the criminal justice system. So can you give us 5 minutes of your time just to comment on this one clip I want to show?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So this is just as by way of background, Polyev was asked about national safety and homeland security and all that crap. And he went on and on about how he's going to get tough on crime and he's going to invoke this provision of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the equivalent in Canada of the US Bill of Rights, which allows the government, it's called the notwithstanding clause, which allows the government to basically violate constitutionally protected rights by invoking this clause. He said he's going to do it in order to, subject certain types of criminals to even harsher penalties than the Canadian judiciary is willing to countenance. So that was the background. And in that context, here's what Jagmeet Singh had to say about getting tough on crime.
I just started by saying, let's not let Mr. Polyev get away with making this ludicrous claim that anyone on this stage thinks that violent crime should get a less severe penalty. Obviously, that is not a special position that he's taking. Everyone agrees that horrible crimes should have horrible sentences. Judges are equipped to do that, so don't let Mr. Polyev's rhetoric confuse people. Obviously, everyone agrees that if someone does something horrible, they should pay a horrible price for it. There should be appropriate sentence that's put in place by a judge. But what I'm concerned about is all of what Mr. Polyev is talking about is after the fact. Now, there's heinous things that happen, and there needs to be severe penalties put in place. But we also need to keep communities safe. And that's what my focus is. Well, how do we stop crime before it happens? Much of the violent crime that's committed is committed by illegal handguns and firearms that come across the border. Now, Mr. Poilievre has admitted that as well, that it is illegal handguns and illegal weapons that are used in violent crime. So our plan is, let's stop those illegal weapons getting into our country in the first place. And the way we do that is by having stronger border security officers and having more people on the border. Mr. Pierre Poilievre, when he was in power in the Conservatives, they cut the number of border officers. They reduced the number, weakening our borders.
Keeping an eye on time.
Okay, so you heard horrible crimes deserve horrible sentences, severe punishments, horrible price. That's the language that he employed. Everybody on that stage, we don't have time to show it to you, adopted similar language. And by the way, when he said, yes, I'm all for, stopping guns from getting into the country, but he didn't actually talk about the causes of crime. What causes crime? But the main point here, Yves, that I want to touch upon is that nowhere in all of the discussion during this debate did anybody talk about the need for rehabilitation. Aren't we supposed to be designing a criminal justice system that rehabilitates offenders so that they can come back into society and be productive members of society, law-abiding members of society? There was zero discussion, not even the nominally left-wing candidate on the stage talked about rehabilitation or the true causes of crime. Now, Yves, because you had the audacity to criticize a genocidal racist by the name of Dalia Kurtz, they threw your ass in jail in Montreal for 5 days, and you got a glimpse of what goes on in the prisons of this country. And I'm not suggesting that gives you some kind of comprehensive view of the prison system, but you and I talked about this after you were released from prison, this outrageous persecution that you've undergone for criticizing this genocidal racist Dalia Kurtz. Could you tell us about that time you spent in prison and what you saw? Did you see any indication in there that this system is designed to rehabilitate people and bring them back into society as productive members?
No. There, in the unit I was in, there was this guy who was 65, 70, who was clearly probably home, unhoused, and he shit himself and just kind of all over his area. And later on, he was given a diaper, and he put his diaper on top of his pants, so he didn't understand where his diaper, should be. This guy was there. Like, I have no idea why this guy was there, what he was accused of, but he was there. Clearly, this guy needed help. He needed physical help. He needed mental help. He needed deep care. I mean, like in every sense of that word. But he was thrown in jail. I don't know exactly how long he was there for. I can't imagine he would have done anything that was that damaging to society. Certainly nothing as damaging as the tar sands companies that are polluting and destroying our ability to survive on this planet. The CEOs of those companies, and I totally agree that the fact that basically Poilievre has set the tone for the whole discussion, which is a punitive discussion, it's not effective. It's not an effective strategy from the standpoint. I mean, even dropping some moral questions, even if it was effective, but it's not even actually an effective strategy in terms of lessening the social problems of crime, and obviously rehabilitation and different programs to avoid different things. Be that everything from better daycare services to lunch programs in schools to better after-school care to better community center programs that offer sports opportunities to teenagers, to all kinds of different types of interventions that are to better housing. I mean, one of the people I saw, I talked to a fair bit in jail, I found very interesting. He was there for domestic abuse. Okay, and I don't know enough about. I presume more or less that he did abuse his partner in some way, and it was basically a breach of conditions. But a really important part of his issue was that when they had a dispute, his partner got the house, the apartment that they were renting, which was from his perspective a really good deal. It was like $700, close to a metro here in Montreal, and it was something that his uncle had given him, and then his partner had come in. So a really important stressor in their whole relationship was housing, and it manifests itself with this, abusiveness in their relationship, and then it led to him being put in jail. But an important part of avoiding this whole issue was having housing policy where this guy could be, who had actually been on the street. He'd been in a house for many years in his late teens, he told me. A really important part of avoiding him being in jail was having housing opportunities that were, not too expensive, so he wasn't so stressed about finding himself back in the street as he'd been previously. So when you start getting into it, when you actually start talking to people who are in jail, I mean, this is a really small sample, multiple days, but easily you could tell right away there was important social elements to this. And then you get into it and you see you're in jail. The cost of it is ridiculous. For our unit, there's a person there 24 hours, more than one person, all night long, just sitting in a cubicle, watching us, observing us the whole night long, being paid to do that, right? So the cost of incarcerating people is often far greater than the cost of just intervening before you get to that stage with something like better social housing opportunities, that you lessen conflict within a relationship, you lessen tension within a relationship that leads to that, and then you can go, obviously delve into all the different elements. But yeah, it's a pretty grim situation where even the supposed left-wing party can't openly state that the principal way, not the only way, but the principal way to avoid the social costs of crime is by social interventions and rehabilitate those who are already in the system, and there's obviously far too little of that takes place.
Right. Now, I'm going to give you an opportunity to chime in, Alex, in a minute. But before that, Yves, do you have any time for Q&A? After Alex answers, I was going to invite people to ask us questions for about 15 minutes. You're muted, Yves.
I'll be a little bit back and forth, but so I'll probably turn my camera off, but I can do a little bit, yeah. Okay, and one other thing, Yves, when you do have to go, if you could just turn off your camera and your mic and stay there, because we need your video to upload to StreamYard when you're done. Thank you very much. So before we turn it over to Q&A, and by the way, people, if you have any questions, please start putting them into the chat while Alex is offering his views on Jagmeet Singh's crime rant or anti-crime rant.
Well, what I found really particular about what Jagmeet said in that debate was that he said we need to put in place hard penalties, like as if the penalties that are already there are not strong enough. So it's kind of like, the Democrats there with Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and all that, trying to undermine the right by adopting a tough on crime approach. I saw elements of that in what Jagmeet was saying. And as Yves mentioned, the housing crisis is something that can really push a lot of people towards fentanyl and crime and that sort of thing. I mean, look at where the fentanyl crisis is strongest in Canada. It's in British Columbia, where the housing crisis is, more significant arguably than anywhere else in the country. So people start using drugs when they don't have a place to stay, when they're down on hard times and stuff like that. That's how people fall into it. And certainly not having a place to call home is a major destabilizing factor in anybody's life. Actually, I'm sort of dealing with it right now because the apartment building that I live in is for sale, and my housing has become precarious depending on who the new owner is going to be. But a lot of people are living that, and a lot of people are unable to afford just basic groceries and housing. So there will eventually be a spike in crime because of those degrading social conditions and the degrading social safety net in Canada. It's been since the 1970s that there's been cuts one after another to the Canadian social safety net. There's a book out about it. I did an interview on my podcast with Nora Loretto, who has a book, The Decline of the Canadian Social Safety Net. Very interesting to look at the history of how it's been done. But when you look at the Canadian justice system, some people say, well, the penalties are less severe than the United States. Well, that's a good thing. The fact that in Canada, let's say you do the worst crime, which is to kill somebody, it is a life sentence, right? But you have a chance of parole after 25 years. Polyev makes it sound like after 25 years, you walk out of there free. No, like those people are under conditions for the rest of their life. And if somebody after 25 years is judged, to be safe to go and live in a halfway house under supervision, and gives a bit of a motivating factor for them to rehabilitate while in prison. Whereas if you put somebody in there and you say you're going to be here for the next 60 years, like they do in the United States, the people have no incentive to rehabilitate themselves, and it's a really cruel kind of thing that's based on punishment rather than rehabilitation. And often, when these crimes are committed, people are not thinking about the sentences when they're committing the crimes. So you really have a limited impact to how you can dissuade people from committing crimes by increasing the sentences. And it's an oversimplification. It's easy for any right-wing politician to say, oh, we got to get tough on crime, we got to throw more people in jail and stuff like that. That's the last thing we need to do. It's the last thing we need to be spending our tax dollars on is building more prisons and incarcerating more people. There's already a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canada's prison systems. And we need to look at ways of preventing these crimes by ensuring that people don't need to commit them because they have proper housing, because they have proper drug treatment options. And, with respect to the NDP, provincially in BC, they've really backed off of a lot of the harm reduction and decriminalization of drugs and that sort of thing. So they are being influenced by the right-wing narrative. And it shows that it's really still the right wing that is setting the agenda for Canadian politics, and that's setting and framing these different issues. To see Jagmeet say something so favorable to the Conservative position on that, I think is a problem. To say that, to imply that there's some sort of a consensus that Canada needs to punish crime through tougher sentences, I think is a really completely absurd thing for a left-wing party to say.
Hear, hear. Okay, so let's do some Q&A. We're only going to have, unfortunately, about 15 minutes. Sorry about that, folks. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Before we start answering a few questions, again, if you like the discussion, please like this video. If you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, please become one. Help us to grow our audience. We've experienced really great growth in the first year. We're now approaching 70,000 subscribers, and our goal is to exceed 100,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so you can help us to do that. So the first question is from Jawad Minhas. I put it up on the screen there. Please address the delusion of a two-state solution for Palestine-Israel conflict as held by all these quote-unquote leaders. And that is, in fact, what I've been referring to it for some time now. I don't call it the two-state solution. I call it the two-state delusion. If you look at the extent of the settlements in the West Bank, and you consider the fact that the 800,000 or so illegal settlers, many of them are armed, many of them are messianic, fanatical in every sense of the word, and you have an Israeli state that is totally unwilling to confront them and remove them from that territory, and in fact is hell-bent on putting more people into the West Bank, and now is basically, as Donald Trump himself acknowledged, has turned the Gaza Strip into a demolition site. That's what he called it, with contaminants everywhere, unexploded ordnance everywhere. The only way to give justice to the Palestinian people now, in my opinion, is a one-state solution. Having said that, I think ultimately it's up to them. So I would respect whatever decision the Palestinian people make in that regard. But from a practical perspective, I just don't see how a two-state solution is any longer possible. And I think that despite the constant references to a two-state delusion, or solution as they call it, in the conventional political discourse in the West, they don't really mean it, Western governments. They have absolutely no desire to give the Palestinian people a state. That's why how can you reconcile their claim that they want a two-state solution with the fact that they're arming a state that is committing genocide against the occupied people? This is absurd. This is all just theater. It's all kabuki theater. And it's time for us to call this out. And it's time for us to have the courage to declare that Israel no longer has a right to exist, if it ever had one. There should be one state between the river and the sea in which everybody has equal rights. Alex, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think talking about the two-state solution is an easy thing for some politicians to do because, as you mentioned, are they going to support Palestinian sovereignty? Are they going to provide arms and security guarantees to a Palestinian state? I doubt it. And it's also a way of sort of kicking the can further down the road, saying, oh, eventually we would like to have a two-state solution. It's an aspirational goal and all this, but concretely, it doesn't change anything in the short term. It doesn't mean that Canada is withdrawing its support for Israel or even daring to use the word genocide. So it's really just a lot of hot air, and it's a way of deflecting. And it's unfortunate that's where we're at in Canadian politics.
Yeah. Now, another question. I think you're well positioned to answer this question, Alex. Has there been any support for Palestine from Aboriginal leaders? This is from Pauline Martin.
Please go ahead. There's widespread support for Palestine from Indigenous leaders in Canada. One that comes to mind is Ellen Gabriel. She was the spokesperson of the Mohawks during the 1990 Oka crisis, in which the Canadian military intervened on an Indigenous community that was trying to protect its burial site from the development of a luxury golf course. She has been one of the most consistent and outspoken voices for Palestine, present at many of the demonstrations across the country. And I think that there's a lot of Indigenous people who, recognize the Canadian Indigenous struggle for rights and recognition and respect and security with the Palestinian cause. So there's definitely a lot of links between those two movements.
I just want to add to that the Israel lobby for at least 20 years has been working fairly hard to try to undermine that, and they've brought different Assembly of First Nations leaders and band council leaders and stuff like that to Israel, and they've just worked really hard to build up because they worry about the fact that those comparing settler colonialism here to settler colonialism in Palestine, and that being a framework of looking at the Palestinian issue and obviously decolonization here. So there has been a pretty significant effort to try to undermine that. But of course there are. There was a resolution also passed at the AFN assembly about 6 or 8 months into the genocide that it kind of, I think, came kind of from the sort of youth of the AFN leadership. That was an okay resolution.
Yeah, and I just to chime in on what Yves said, I totally agree, with Alex that overwhelmingly. What I've seen from the Indigenous communities in Canada is strong, passionate support for the Palestinian cause. But it's also true that the lobby has been working overtime to enlist Indigenous persons to its cause. One notorious such person is a character by the name of Ryan Belrose, who is an extreme Zionist. He's Métis. And there also is, more recently, I'm trying to get it up on the screen, somebody who actually sat on the Ontario Court of Appeal, an Indigenous lawyer by the name of Harry Laforme and Karen Restoul. They authored an op-ed during this genocide in the National Post, probably the most Zionist major media outlet in Canada. And the title of their op-ed, this was in November of last year, was "We Are Ashnabi Zionists, Hateful Anti-Israel Camps Disrespect Our Lands." That same person, Harry Laforme, as I mentioned, a former Ontario Court of Appeal judge, signed a letter last year that was signed by some 20 Zionist lawyers condemning law students at Toronto Metropolitan University who had signed a letter shortly after the genocide began condemning Israel, and basically called for these law students. He joined with other Zionist lawyers calling for these law students who were simply defending the victims of a genocide to be expelled from law school and for the legal profession to basically blackball them. So I think this is very much a minority, a small, tiny minority view within the Aboriginal communities. But sadly, the Zionist lobby has been successful in recruiting some members of the Aboriginal, the Indigenous communities to their cause. And as I say, I think probably Harry Laforme is the most notable one. In any event, let's go to another question. We had somebody from a question from N. Rabinoff, a question for Dimitri. I'm probably going to punt this one to you, Alex.
Okay.
The question is the Green Party a NATO psyop? They certainly seem to be in Germany.
Right. Well, look, the Green Party movement, founded over 40 years ago, has been faced with a lot of people kind of selling out to the establishment and taking on these hawkish positions on foreign policy and that sort of thing. So the Green Party of Germany, one of the first Green parties to have mainstream success, has been at the forefront of supporting the war in Ukraine, for calling for weapons shipments. And this is not just like a small marginal Green Party. Like the leader of the Green Party, Annalena Baerbock, is actually the foreign minister of Germany. And of course, Germany is one of the countries that's also arming Israel. So it's really unfortunate. Myself, I've been leader of the Green Party of Quebec for almost 12 years now. And to see my colleagues selling out this way and really becoming what the movement was founded to oppose. Here in Canada, that's it. There's a complete pro-NATO drift within the Green Party of Canada. They try and vilify people like me who are critical of NATO. They try and paint us as Russian agents and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's where the Green Party of Canada is at on that. And I know that there's been some people that have been affiliated with NATO who have been sort of lurking around the party, and I'm not sure what level of influence they had. But it's also a reflection of Canadian society because our media environment here is 100% pro-NATO. And, I went through this myself. I took a very strong position against the war in Ukraine, and I was vilified by the mainstream media for the past 3 years. Even just last week, casually on a right-wing trash radio show, they suggested, oh, well, 2 police officers said that Alex Tyrrell's a Russian agent. So we're living in this climate where the mainstream is always pumping out a pro-NATO message that's always trying to discredit anybody who speaks against NATO or against the proxy wars or against military spending. So the Green Party is definitely a reflection of that. And as we were discussing about the Israeli lobby's efforts towards Indigenous people in Canada, there is a NATO lobby too, and there is pressures that are put on people. And in Canada, this NATO lobby and Israel lobby is lurking almost everywhere. Even when I used to be in the NDP under Jack Layton, and we actually, after the Orange Wave, when all those MPs were elected, we had Israeli lobbyists showing up and interacting with the volunteers at like volunteer events and stuff like that. And they were describing themselves as human rights activists. So they're not targeting only the leaders or only the MPs, like they trickle down right to the people who just stepped into the party off the street there to volunteer to put up a few posters and stuff like that. So it shows how much energy is being put in to obtain Canadians' consent for war in Palestine, for war with Russia, and also for war with China. We're constantly in this fear-based politics. So the Green Party is a reflection of that. And there's definitely some people that have been affiliated with NATO that have been in there. There's actually the president of the youth wing who was like 16 years old, but he was like involved with the Canadian NATO Association. And this is an association, a nonprofit that's funded by NATO. And on their website, they had a study showing that young people are less likely to support U.S. intervention around the world, less likely to support warfare, military spending, NATO, military alliances, that sort of thing. And so they identify this as a massive problem and lay out different actions that could be taken to build up youth support for NATO within Canada. And they had this 16-year-old youth president of the Green Party of Canada that was literally going around like jet setting, flying into like NATO meetings all over the world, meeting with the Secretary General and stuff like that. Really crazy stuff. And I think the person has now left the Green Party. They're no longer listed as the youth president, but it shows that there is a substantiated effort to influence people and to influence political parties to support NATO.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to your commentary, Alex, with which I agree, is that look, I don't have evidence that any particular person in a position of authority in the Canadian Green Party or any other Green Party in the West is a NATO psyop or somehow acting on behalf of some Western intelligence agency. So I can't, and I'm not going to speculate about that. All I will say is I think it would be naive of us to assume that is not happening. I think it is entirely possible that Western intelligence agencies, not just the Green Party, any party that is anti-hegemonic, anti-imperialist, that poses any kind of a nonviolent threat to the elites and to the war machine is probably going to be targeted in some manner by Western intelligence agencies. Whether they plant people in these parties, I don't know. But I'm sure that there are efforts, as Alex indicated, there are efforts being made to co-opt these parties, turn these parties into supporters of the war machine. And that has tended to happen to any party, anti-imperialist party in the West that actually gains representation in the national legislature. So we shouldn't be naive about this, but we shouldn't, be paranoid about it either.
Yeah, there's the formal lobbies, but there's also just networks where they train people. Like, for example, the Canadian Jewish Public Affairs Committee has a fellowship program which is reserved only for pro-Israel students, and they boast that they pump people through this fellowship program with the goal of having them work in MP offices and political parties after in all parties, right? And you have to be pro-Israel to get into the program, right? So they promise you access to a network of politicians in all the parties, and you can really move up. They boast that about half the people that go through that program end up working for members of parliament. So, it's not necessarily that those people, when they're working for MPs, they're not necessarily receiving money from the Israeli lobby, but they've sort of like been trained by them and are then being paid by the MPs themselves.
Correct. Absolutely. So we'll take two more questions. So this question, I need to give you a little background. Big Meanie asks, any response to your challenge to debate the attorneys who deplatformed the Syrian immigrant? So just for those who aren't aware of the background to this question, there is this organization of lawyers in Canada called the Advocate Society. It's made up of about 6,000 judges and lawyers and other legal professionals. And it holds this big posh annual gala in June. They invited a Syrian refugee to be the keynote speaker in this event in Toronto. It's called the End of Term Dinner. And apparently this Syrian refugee at some point, I checked out his social media commentary. It was not by any means radical or anything. And I thought I saw one post on his X account from the last 4 months where he said anything about Palestine, and all he did was refer to the film at the Oscars, the documentary called No Other Land that won the Oscar for Best Documentary, which was done by both an Israeli and a Palestinian. So this man was not a radical, but apparently sometime in the past, he referred to what's being done to the people of Gaza accurately as a genocide. And so there was this huge uproar, and a bunch of very wealthy, powerful lawyers pressured the Advocate Society into withdrawing his invitation. So at that point, I put out a report. And by the way, the lawyer who was reported by the Canadian press to have led that charge is a character by the name of Jonathan Lysis, who's a very successful corporate lawyer on Bay Street in Toronto. And also some major unnamed law firms were behind this effort to deplatform the Syrian refugee as well. So I issued a challenge to Jonathan Lysis to debate me on the question of whether Israel is committing genocide. I also issued the challenge to the president of the Advocate Society, a lawyer, another very successful corporate lawyer by the name of Darrell Cruz, who I happened to go to law school with a long time ago. So I know these two characters personally. I sent them my debate challenge 3 weeks ago. And I also said in my challenge, if you're not willing to debate me, find a Zionist lawyer who's willing to debate me, find the most persuasive person you can to represent the no side of this question about whether Israel is committing genocide. And they didn't even respond. So I'm going to be expanding my challenge in the next week to a number of other very prominent, outspoken Zionist lawyers, and we'll see if any of them takes up the cause. I don't expect that they're going to agree to debate me, not because they can't handle themselves in a debate. They all can. They're very successful lawyers, but because they don't have a leg to stand on based upon the evidence and the law. They have absolutely no leg to stand on. And in a formalized debate with a moderator and, reasonable rules around how you conduct the debate, they're going to lose. They're going to lose that debate hands down because it is a slam dunk that Israel's committing genocide. So we'll see. I don't think they'll accept my invitation, but hopefully one of them will. So the last question I'm going to show you, this is clearly a question for Alex, and I think I know what the answer is, Alex. This is from our friend Yuri Smuter, who's wasn't able to stay with us. And his question is actually to you and Yves. If one votes for anti-imperialism, who do you vote for in Quebec, Alex?
Yeah, that's that's a very tough question, right? Like, as I mentioned at the outset, like, I've never felt less inspired to vote than in this election. So it's a tricky choice, For myself, I still think that the Green Party is the most viable vehicle for the Canadian left. And obviously, I've poured, over a decade of work into the Green Party brand. So I'm going to be voting for the Green Party, even though I've got deep reservations about it that, I've spoken openly about. If you look at like the vote compass, like it's very close with the NDP. It's very similar. But I do think that the Green Party is a better vehicle, even though the leadership needs to be changed as quickly as possible after this election. We need like kind of regime change there within the Green Party of Canada. But I do believe that it is the most viable vehicle for the left. And somebody asked me the other day, like, what should they do if they're in Jonathan Pedneau's riding? And I told them I'm really glad that I don't have to make that decision, but I will be supporting the Green Party. And I think it's up to everybody to really look at, what they think is the best vote for anti-imperialism. I can't really make a convincing argument that it's the Green Party, but I will be voting for them because I think it's the most viable vehicle.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for sticking with us. And wonderful questions. Thank you for the questions. Just one last note before we sign off. This is Passover to our anybody out there from the audience who is celebrating Passover. We wish you a wonderful Passover. And also this weekend is Orthodox Easter. I happen to be in Greece where everything is shut down and people are getting ready to feast this weekend. So happy Easter to all of those of you out there who are Orthodox Christians. And with that, we look forward to our next conversation, and we're signing off for now. Take care. Peace out.